Hi, and welcome to Lesson 8.1. In Lesson 8.1, you will be classifying, adding, and subtracting polynomials. The two goals are to be able to name a polynomial and to be able to add and subtract. This video is going to be only looking at classification. The next video you can watch will be on adding and subtracting. A polynomial is a combination of many terms. The degree of the term is determined by the power of the variable. So for instance, the term 7x to the third power would be a third degree polynomial. Polynomials are referred to by the degree of their highest term, and that's also how they're named. When you're arranging polynomials, you want to arrange it in standard form. So the terms need to be the highest degree all the way down to the lowest degree. You do the same thing when you combine like terms and then you write your final expression. So this isn't anything that's new. Okay, let's focus on naming polynomials. One of the ways in which we name polynomials is by the number of terms. So if a polynomial only has one term, we would call it a monomial. If it has two terms, we would call it a binomial because the prefix bi means two. If it has three terms, it would be a trinomial, again because the prefix tri means three. And if it has four terms or more, we would just call it a polynomial because the prefix poly means many. We also name polynomials by their degree. So if a polynomial has a degree of 0, it's just a constant. And an example of that would just be like the number 6. If the highest degree is a degree of 1, then we would call it linear. And so for instance, like 2b or 2x or 2y, because the b would have a power of 1. A degree of 2 would be a quadratic. So for instance, like 3x to the second power. Because the variable has the degree of 2, it has second power, we would call it quadratic. A degree of 3 would be cubic, and for example, that would be like 7a to the third power. Because the variable has a degree of 3, it has to the third power be cubic. And then degree 4 would be quartic. So for example, like x to the fourth power. It has a degree of 4 because it has the exponent of 4. And just for fun, if you have a 100th degree polynomial, it's called a hectic. That would be very hectic, wouldn't it? Okay, so let's just practice naming polynomials. We're going to name them by the degree and also by the number of terms. The degree generally goes first. So if we look at 2p to the fourth power plus p to the third power, we want to first look at the degree of the highest term, which is going to be the first term if it's in standard form. And we see that that's a degree of 4. So then if we take a look at the degree column, a fourth degree polynomial would be called a quartic. So we're going to say quartic. But then we also have to look at how many terms it has. And do you see how it has 2 terms in that polynomial? So then if it's 2 terms, it's binomial. So we would call this a quartic binomial. And that's how we would name that polynomial or that expression. On the second one, do you see that the exponent is 2? So this is a second degree polynomial, a degree of 2. And if you look at the column for degree there, a second degree would be called a quadratic. Then, being that there's only one term in this polynomial, we would call it a monomial because the prefix mono means 1. So this would be called a quadratic monomial. In the next example, if you look at the very first term, it's to the fourth power, so it's a degree of 4. We did that one in the first example, so that would be a quartic. But then notice how there are 3 terms. So if we name it also by the number of terms, because there's 3, we would call it a trinomial. So this would be called a quartic trinomial. 2 names when you're classifying. The next one, on the n, you don't see a power, you don't see an exponent, but it's just assumed that it is 1. And so because that's the first power, that would be a linear. And then it has 1 term, so that'd be monomial, a linear monomial. In the next example, look at the variable. Do you see how it doesn't have a power on it? But we would just say that it's to the first power. So again, that would also be linear. And then being that there's 2 terms, we would call it a binomial, so a linear binomial. In the next example, if you look at the first term, it has k to the second power, so that is a degree of 2. And so we would call that quadratic. And being that it has 2 terms, that would be a binomial. So quadratic binomial on this one. Now, in the next example, you see just the number 1, just like if it was the number 5 or 10 or -2. There isn't any variable. So if there's no variable, that means there's no power, and that would be considered just a constant. And then, being that there's just one term, we would call it a monomial. So just a constant monomial. Then in the last example, if you look at the first term, it's to the third power. And third power, if we look, or the degree of 3, that's a cubic. And then, being that there's 4 terms, we would call it a polynomial, because that just means many. So anything after 3, after trinomial, it's just polynomial. So a cubic polynomial on the last one. So when you're naming polynomials, you name it with 2 names. The first one is the degree. That is the exponent of the very first term when it's in standard form, your highest power there. And then the second term, the second name is how many terms there are. And that's your monomial, binomial, trinomial, and polynomial. So 2 names when you're naming polynomials.